and I'm privileged to serve as the Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice here at the University of Pennsylvania. We call ourselves SP2. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second virtual installment of the 2022-2023 Speaker Series, Conversations about Race, Equity, and Justice, with experts on social policy and social work. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's program, Faith in Public Life, which is being hosted by Ben Jealous. Ben is a professor of practice at the Annenberg School for Communication and at SP2, and he is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Penn Carey Law School. A former national president and CEO of the NAACP, he was recently named the next executive director of the Sierra Club. Ben has an unwavering commitment to social change and racial justice that's in perfect alignment with SP2's mission. When he was selected to head the NAACP at age 35, he became the organization's youngest ever national leader. His family's strong community activism dates back generations, and his SP2 connection traces back many decades to his late beloved grandmother, who we're proud to have called an SP2 alumna. As we confront the ongoing issues of racial, social, and economic justice, it continues to be important to explore these topics. This conversation is an example of SP2's dedication to addressing complex social problems through education, research, and civic engagement. Ben, it gives me great pleasure to turn the speaker over to you.
Thank you, Sally. I continue to be excited to host this series, and today's program, focused on faith in public life, really is a highlight for me. If you have questions during the event, please use the Q&A tab to submit them. It's at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can later in the program. And now it's my distinct honor to introduce today's speakers, literally the chaplain of the University of Pennsylvania and the rabbi of the American Civil Rights Movement. Reverend Chaz Howard, University Chaplain and Vice President for Social Equity and Community here at Penn. And Rabbi David Saperstein, a former US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom under the Obama administration, the first non-Christian to serve in that role. He is also Director, Emeritus, and Senior Advisor for Policy Strategy at the Religious Action Center, part of the Union for Reform Judaism. To put that in perspective, it was in their offices that the Voting Rights Act was authored, and they were part of the core leadership coalition that pushed through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and helped end the Europe-only preference immigration to the US. They are an incredible organization. Rabbi Saperstein is an incredible leader.
Thank you, Ben.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Howard and Rabbi Saperstein. Very excited for today's conversation. Faith and organized religion in particular can be a polarizing subject in the US today. It's also the heart for many of us of what motivates us to do great good. And as we experience a rise in Christian nationalism in the US and anti-Jewish hate, faith permeates all aspects of our society. To frame our conversation today, let's apply SP2's social justice lens to faith. Before we dig into that, Reverend Howard is the chaplain of our university. Why don't you start us off with your opening remarks? Can you please speak a bit about how your religious beliefs show up in your professional life?
Sure. It's really good to be on here with you all. And I think I'd first be remiss if I didn't send love to my friend, Dean Bachman, and all the wonderful folks in SP2. I've said to you before, Dean, that I think SP2 in so many ways is the conscience of our university, and very much the heart of a place like Penn. And it is an honor to be even peripherally associated with you all. And to my brothers, Brother Ben Jealous and Rabbi Saperstein, I've been a fan of both of you for a long, long time, and it's an honor to have you as interlocutors. And I'm grateful for the witness that you both provide in our world and the tangible good that you all do. There's a Spanish nun, a 16th century Spanish nun named Teresa of Avila, who has a quote that I often think about in conversations like this. It's very simple. It says, "Do whatever most kindles love in you. Do whatever most kindles love in you." And I think about that when I'm thinking vocational questions. And I try to think about that in sitting across from our students, faculty, staff, and anyone else when we're thinking about what the moment might be calling for a response from people of faith. What response kindles love in us? And so when I think about this notion of faith in public life, faith in society, faith engaging politics, this to me is the guiding question. And to zoom in even more, what does it mean to love radically in our world right now? What does it mean to love the person sitting across from us? To love our peers and colleagues? To love those who are in need? What does it mean to love the stranger? What does it mean to love those who we're disagreeing with? And to love the institutions that are around us? And sometimes that love calls for a certain type of compassion. I think in a moment right now, and as you alluded to Ben, where we've seen a painful and dangerous and heartbreaking and quite literally deadly uptick in anti-Semitism, uptick in anti-Asian hate, uptick in the violence against our queer neighbors, anti-Black violence. What does it mean to love in those moments? I think a big part of that is drawing from wells of compassion. I think love is also standing up and saying enough and fighting on behalf of others. Loving radically is also pushing institutions to do better. I think in so many ways, this is what it means to live one's faith in public life. It's loving in a way that changes the world. The other side of faith in public life that I think about, and then I'll hand it over to Rabbi Saperstein. My wife and I used to co-teach a course called Faith in Politics, and my wife is a political scientist, and so you can tell we're a lot of fun at dinner parties. The two things you're not supposed to talk about in public, religion and politics. And at the beginning of these classes, often our students were of one of two camps. They either were understandably deeply critical of religion broadly for legit reasons, for legit sort of demonstrable reasons of be it the Crusades or the Inquisition or the way that faith has divided people historically, or forced conversions or killing in the name of faith traditions. And they're really skeptical about the not only the relevance, but the role that religion can play in public life, and rightly so. We also have students who sort of are champions of religion and champions of faith traditions and say, look, these world religions are responsible for so much of so many hospitals and so much of our education system. And if you look around, our America, religious groups are doing after-school programs and prisoner reentry programs, and so many shelters for the unhoused come from religious spaces, and so much good. I think the reality is they're both right at the same time. And so I think a big part of in this question of how I see our faith in public life playing out, trying to call us, if I could use a religious phrase, to our better angels and push back on the kind of ugly that religion can and is in real time doing in the world right now. Recognizing that complexity and trying to bring out the best out of religious groups and religious people, including myself. Rabbi?
Well, thank you. Reverend Howard and I had really not had a chance to meet. We've known about each other, and you have got a great reputation, and to hold the position that you do at such a prestigious university with such a remarkable student body is really, I can imagine, an immense challenge these days, but wonderful opportunities it is, I'm sure, afforded you. Dean Bachman, thank you for this here, but Dean Bachman, it really is a wonderful program. I'm sure one of many wonderful programs your school is involved with, but let me just say you've got a great staff of your work with in the SP2 program, and I'm really blessed to have gotten to know them. As will become clear, I think, in part of the conversation, Ben Jealous and I go back a long, long way, and we have worked together in a number of different organizations, the Leadership Conference and Civil Rights, to the NAACP, People for the American Way, as we'll continue to work together in the Sierra Club. Ben is one of the towering social justice figures in America of our generation, of this generation. Here, one of the true visionary leaders, and he did remarkable things at every one of the institutions that he's led. And God knows at this moment in America's history, we need it more than ever. And I know how important faith is to him as well. And I could listen to him talk on this topic the whole time here. So I hope it'll be a back and forth amongst all of us. Let me just make a couple of descriptive comments, and then I'll talk at some point later in the conversation about where I think religion ought to be. But just both personally, as you asked, Ben, and then more broadly about faith in public life. I grew up in the New York area on Long Island. My father was a beloved congregational rabbi, served 50 years in one congregation that grew from 60 to 1,000 families, then served three of the largest synagogues in the world, West London Synagogue, Central Synagogue in New York, and Rodef Shalom. He had a storied career. At the core of his rabbinate was social justice. He made that a centerpiece of what it was. My mother was one of the three creators of the Long Island Women's Forum in the 1950s and 60s, an umbrella group of 300 women's organizations raising women's issues, and one of the committee of 8 who oversaw the NAACP's litigation in my hometown about de facto segregation. We had living patterns in which the communities were separate, but in one high school and one junior high in which they were all together with no problems, but we wanted to see the elementary schools desegregated as well. And my mother was part of that civil rights campaign. And my older brother, one of the great Jewish historians of this generation, also passionate, committed champion of social justice. But all of them spoke and wove together in their lives, the way they lived their lives and the way they did their academic work and the way they preached their speeches and sermons, weaving together social justice and the core values of Judaism, those core values that you all know so well. The fundamental dignity of every person derived from the belief that we are all created in the image of God. The stories in the Jewish tradition of why are we all descended from one single couple, Adam and Eve. So we all know we're brothers and sisters. None of us can claim that our ancestors were any worthier than anyone else's. The belief in freedom of choice. I've set before you this day, life and death, the blessing and the curse, good and evil here. No idea of fates that play games with human destiny, no limitation on human freedom, like as with Calvinist predestination ideas. This was a central idea of freedom of choice, the belief in the perfectibility of people and societies here, and the belief that God called us to create, to be pursuers of justice and peace. God is allowing us to make that world that is promised in either with a blueprint of which is in our sacred texts. In many different religious traditions, God has called us to be partners in making that world of justice and peace that we're called to create a reality. And what a blessing that is for all of us, in the sense that God has called us to protect all of God's creation, a profoundly religious idea. And one of religion's greatest contributions to ethical thought, this idea of of we have a moral responsibility to generations yet to come. What greater, more urgent understanding is there as we think about protecting God's creation at this moment of climate change that threatens the world. Each of us in our own faith traditions can talk about those faith ideas, but those faith ideas have animated human history. 80% of the people in the world identify with some organized religious community here and see a belief in God or a belief in spiritual meaning or a belief in some religious community as central ways of organizing their lives, as it is central to their lives. So we're never going to achieve anything that we're seeking to achieve if we can't engage the religious community in such an effort. Here, it is a rich reservoir of moral and ethical ideals, as many times as we've failed to live up to them, and we'll talk about that. But it is also a reservoir of human resources that have the ability to transform the world. So when we talk about faith in public life, faith is absolutely indispensable to the creation of the public life that not only we strive for, but that our children so richly deserve.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Rabbi. Chaz, Reverend Howard, I would like your permission just to talk to you as a fellow Christian for a second, knowing that as chaplain, you steward the spiritual life of the entire university and all the faiths therein. When I think about in this moment of rising Christian nationalism in the U.S., where it seems like every major mention of Christianity in public life is increasingly problematic. Most recently, Kanye West, put out a call to Christian nationalism in the worst kind of way in the midst of professing his admiration for Hitler and everything else. What pains me as a Christian raised in a civil rights family is that when I look back, this is the faith that helped lead my ancestors out of slavery. You look at the Quaker tradition in Pennsylvania, right? It really made Pennsylvania a haven in so many ways. It's manifested that tradition in Bayard Rustin, a great Black gay Quaker organizer, architect to the March on Washington. Everything that's good about Ben Franklin, a white guy who was indentured by his brother, can really kind of go back to his faith. And right up through Dr. King. And then what haunts me increasingly, I'm turning 50, so I'm starting to feel like almost old. What haunts me increasingly as my beard turns gray is that there's an article by a Jew in The Nation back in the 90s that was a call for progressive Christians to find their voice again. And the way that he ended that piece, he said, basically, what happened to y'all? After Dr. King was assassinated, you guys put down the Bible, and the far right wing picked up the Christian Bible and has been beating the rest of us over the head with it ever since, and it hurts. So please take it back from them on behalf of everything that Dr. King stood for. Dr. King, speaking as a Christian, this Jewish activist explained, never made him feel diminished as a Jew. Rather, it made him feel affirmed as a person of faith. Dr. King, of course, at the center of his theology, like that of Rabbi Saperstein, really is the golden rule, if you get right down to it, that unites all people of faith, of every faith, all around us, do unto others. What is wrong? What is our problem as Christians, I'd say, who are inspired to do good and to love others and be radical, in the praxis of love for humanity? Why have we become so meek since Dr. King was assassinated? Why has our voice disappeared from the public square? And how do we, in the context of a secular university, a diverse university, encourage the best in the Christian students who are there to speak up in the way that Jewish activist was begging we do again?
It's a big, hard question and the absolute right question to ask for the moment, my brother. I mean, and there's so many ways to engage it and attack it and respond. I think the first one is to complicate the question, because I have a lot of friends, as I know you do, who are asking the same thing. Get your boy. What's wrong with your people? Why are they attacking the Capitol? Why they do that? Why y'all do that? Why y'all doing this and it's like what's wrong with your cousin? And that's a legit check, because as painful as it is, they are a part of the church. And I think we can talk about whatever, but like, they are our cousins, and we have some level of responsibility to kind of get them and challenge them and love them back and heal them and love them back into decency and kindness. On the other hand, I think it's important to name the conflation that has happened with white nationalism and kind of a Christian nationalism, with a deep homophobia, with a deep sexism, with a deep anti-Semitism and Christian nationalism. And in some ways, I think that those sort of negative forces have become the driving force of some Christian nationalism. And I think some of the evidence is, some of our evangelical brothers and sisters will point out that the folks who are being described as kind of evangelical Christian nationalists, who are very much the bulk of a good chunk of Trump voters, actually don't go to church, actually don't do any kind of daily devotional thing, actually aren't big Bible readers. I say that because that's not to distance ourselves from them. It's to say that ultimately they're a driving force of why they would want to attack the Capitol, why they would vote for someone like President Trump, why they would push against equal rights in any category, has to do with more of a white fear and a white nationalism and a fear of America sort of falling away from them, as opposed to Christianity being the driving force in their thing. We use examples in the past of, there were so many Christians and preachers who supported slavery, who were against civil rights and stuff like that. I think that's absolutely true. Were they against slavery because of the Bible? Maybe. Or were they against slavery because of what it would mean for their business and for society, and they don't want their kids marrying Black people? Like, I think that's an important thing to name as well. The other thing, and then I'll stop filibustering, is this notion of who are we paying attention to? It's so easy right now to lift up someone like Brother Kanye West as the most important Christian in America right now, and not someone like William Barber, Shane Claiborne, folks like that who are fighting against the death penalty, against gun rights, fighting for equal voting rights, like someone like Raphael Warnock. I think people whose witness is so much stronger and richer. Where progressive Christians go, like, one just got elected back to the Senate last night. Like, they never left. But who's taking up all the air in the room? People like Kanye. People like Falwell. Others who have really loud microphones and make us all look really, really bad and need to be pushed back on, but are not at all the only, and aren't even close to the majority of Christians in this country. That's not, again, to distance ourselves and give ourselves a pass on that. That's us too. But that's not the guy we should be pointing at first, and not the one I think we should lift up as the face of a 2,000-year-old religion.
Well, let me kind of keep pushing that for a second. As a guy who went no further than his year of discernment with the Episcopal Diocese of New York before being called in a different direction, but a little further than most. The Rabbi Saperstein, you speak about your father's ministry, and I've never heard you do that before. And it, in many ways, is a blueprint for your ministry as I know it, right? Because you took what was a mainline denomination within the broader Abrahamic tradition in the United States and breathed new life into it and empowered it to grow, like your father did those congregations, by putting activism at the center of what would define Reformed Judaism now for going on 3 generations. What would your advice be to all of the mainline Protestant Christian leaders whose churches are dwindling, whose denominations are dwindling. I joke as a Black Episcopalian, Reverend Howard, that I came from one of those churches that Jesus describes in the Bible, where there are two of you gathered. Right? And so, Rabbi Saperstein, what would you say if we had all the people representing all the denominations that had kings back here? Because we know their churches are dwindling, their denominations are dwindling, and but for the power of compound interest, they might not even exist today.
So let me respond to that, and then depending on how long I go on with that response, here I do want to pick up on Reverend Howard's fascinating and insightful comments as well here. So first of all, the story about the very brief story about the Reformed Jewish movement, I have very little credit for. There were others who really helped shape it in the direction that you were talking about. I happened to be in the right place at the right time to give an institutional expression to it and to strengthen what they were already doing, but they were really the pioneers. So let me explain. It is true, if you look at and compare 1960 to 2020, and you look at the Episcopalian, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, United Church of Christ, Congregationalist, go down the list of what we call the mainline Protestant denominations, they're all 25 to 60% smaller than they were back then. It's true in the Jewish community of the conservative Jewish movement as well, the same kind of dynamic. The only theologically liberal denomination in the country that has grown and grown by leaps and bounds has been the Reformed Jewish movement. So for those of our participants in this webinar that are interested in studying religion, it's really fascinating to take a look at why that might be true. And let me try to lay out the reasons why I think it is, because they're exactly what you were alluding to, Ben. First, and a lot was the president of the Reform movement in Alexander Schindler, and I'll come to him in a moment. Earlier, when the Reform movement took shape in the late 1800s here, and then during the first 60 years of the 20th century, social justice was always a centerpiece. We believed that every religion, and Jews in particular, had a prophetic mission to speak truth to power. And we were living in a country that welcomed that mission from the religious communities, guaranteeing our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, our freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances, our freedom of association. Where in the world had that ever happened before? And particularly for religious minorities, but for any of us, to be able to take that message. Can you imagine Jesus of Nazareth having an opportunity to have the platforms that are available now in a global way? Boy, could we use that voice more than ever in history right now? So this is a different world. It really is in that regard. And that was a centerpiece of who we were. And then Alex Schindler said, if we're really serious about our values, let's talk about our own Jewish life in our own synagogues. It's time for us to ordain women as rabbis. And we were the first to ordain women as rabbis. And now women make up the majority of the clergy of our congregations, of Jewish congregations outside the Orthodox community in general now. And he said, let's open our doors to intermarried families here and welcome them and show audacious hospitality to all who wanted to come to our synagogue. And he was the first to call for opening our synagogues to the LGBTQ community. First, our movement accepted an LGBTQ synagogue into our movement, enormously controversial at the time in the early 1980s here, but he called on all the synagogues to open their doors to LGBTQ members here, and that helped. And then finally, we never gave up the centrality of social justice. So for Jews who believe religion should stand for something in terms of having a voice in public life, of justice and peace, and equality, and here, we became kind of the home for growing numbers of Jews at the time. So I think that really has affirmed, it's not just theory, Ben, this idea that social justice and religion can really work to reinforce each other. I think our movement, I'm proud to say, is the embodiment. And then I was blessed to actually have a job where somebody paid me to do that work on behalf of this extraordinary movement is really, truly the blessing of my life. And I'll pick up on the other thing afterwards.
I can see the spirit moving, Reverend Howard. So Reverend Howard, please say what you're moved to say. What I would ask is that you also speak to the value of audacious hospitality. Because when I sit with a lot of sort of movement Christians, people who follow people like Reverend Barber, they tend to fall in two camps. Either they are culturally Southern and they get audacious hospitality in their bones, or they're culturally Northern and they think it's fake. And yet, what you see when you look at the Christian right is a lot of what pulls people in is audacious hospitality, is people literally affirming in this world of increasing isolation that they matter, that they count, that they are worth something, that God loves them and the congregation loves them. So I would challenge you, Reverend Howard, respond as you would, but if you could speak to that, because I see that in who you are too.
So many signs around the country say the Episcopal Church welcomes you. And so, Brother Ben, the Episcopal Church would welcome you back into the discernment process. Man, you're over here preaching on this webinar, man. So come on back.
I am the one who got away from Canon Fred Williams.
Oh, never too late. Never too late. It's such a good word around hospitality. It changed my life. And if I could share very briefly, both my parents died when I was young, and my older sister, who was 12 years older than me, took me in and kind of raised me. And long story short, she was looking for somewhere to get a kid off the streets of Baltimore over the summer. And she found a summer camp in Maine that offered our family a little scholarship. And I went up there and it was a sports camp. It was great. I was the only Black camper at this all-white camp in Maine. And the first Friday rolled around and we were kind of ushered into the dining hall. And I remember I wrote a letter to my sister telling this story. One of the counselors was giving us all what I wrote, these little caps. And we all put these caps on, and then all the white people around me started speaking a different language. And it turned out to be a Jewish summer camp that I was sent to. I remember being stunned and surprised and confused. I went to that camp for 10 years because my campmates, my counselors welcomed the stranger and demonstrated a deep hospitality to a kid who was really in need. I learned biblical Hebrew there. I sang the Shema every Friday night. I found out later, a lot of them thought that I was Ethiopian and that they thought I was Jewish the whole time, which is okay. But they still showed a deep hospitality to an orphan from Baltimore in a way that I never forgot. I bring that story up because it made an impression on me. That kind of just basic decency to look out for someone else. And this is when I see religion at its best, when one of our students comes out to one of their Christian campus ministers, expecting to be chased away, but instead is brought in and loved. When someone shares that they're in an interfaith relationship and they get shown love from their rabbi or their priest or someone, when they have questions, like that hospitality, that changes lives. And as you're saying, brother, I think changes the society. And it's the kind of like basic, simple thing we each can do. We need better of our institutions. And, one of the things I love about Philly right now is certain governors in certain states down south are sort of putting human lives on buses to make political examples and statements of them and sending them up north to places like Philadelphia to sort of push back on immigrants coming to this country. We don't want you here. We're going to send you up to one of the states that does want you here, and we'll see how they deal with it. People in Philly have been welcoming folks, loving them, helping them, give them whatever they need. People of faith and people who aren't of faith. And folks won't forget that hospitality. That's love. That's us being at our absolute best as a city, as a country, as a society, as people of faith. I'm so glad you lifted up this word hospitality, because I think that's at the core of love and at the core of our traditions.
And that phrase, audacious hospitality, was really coined in our community by the current president of the Reform movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, himself a visionary and himself a longtime champion of social justice. So we take that seriously. I think every house of worship that really is a successful house of worship has developed a culture of that kind of hospitality. And I am certain on every campus across this country that those religious communities, Hillel, Newman, those are the mainline Presbyterians and Muslim groups, et cetera, who have really shown, who have really attracted people, it is precisely at a time that people can often feel a real challenge in finding their place in community, that you've offered that love in that community. I know you have done just a great job at the University of Pennsylvania in that, but I think that is a secret to success in so many places here. But I think all of us would also agree it's at its best and strongest in sustaining that here when we also stand for something, when we take the values of our traditions and try and make them real in the world about us. Ben, can I take a moment to address go back to Reverend Howard, your question to Reverend Howard and Reverend Howard's response. We should remember in America, these dynamics between the so-called religious right and the more mainline groups or the liberal religious communities, this is not new. This has been part of America from its very founding. Here, I mean, think about, who am I describing when I say a group, a large religious community forced to flee oppression and persecution, crossing a dangerous wilderness, in the middle of that wilderness, entering into a covenant with God and aim to a promised land where they arrive and create a new land based entirely on God's laws, right? The children of Israel in the Bible, but it's also the Puritans fleeing persecution in Europe, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, entering into the Mayflower Compact, creating a new land based on God's law. If you look at the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, 1649, and the courts of New England, 1650, every law has a biblical citation next to it. They really thought they were replaying that journey of the children of Israel, and they were the new children of Israel who are creating that kind of land here. And in every one of what we call the religious awakenings, that of the mid-1700s that dotted the landscape of America with local churches, or that of the middle 1800s that created the denominational system that we know today, or that of the 20th century, the religious right, the moral majority, the Christian coalition here, and today the Christian nationalist groups here. That is part of an ongoing tradition that was different than those of many of the founders, the deist framers of our fundamental documents, who said in our Declaration, our human rights, our civil rights are rooted in what God has given every human being. And then when we created a legal structure in our Constitution, God is not mentioned. That can't depend on God. And in the extraordinary words of religion in the Constitution, here, free exercise of religion, no establishment of religion, no religious test for office in America. America created for the first time in human history, ever, a nation in which your rights as a citizen would not depend upon your religious identity, your religious practices, your religious peaceful practices, and your religious beliefs. This was something extraordinary. It is still the mark of what is religious freedom as embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant and Civil and Political Rights, that we still judge religious freedom in every country across the globe. That was one of America's great gifts. And that is yet another strand. And when we think of all the champions of social justice from the religious communities, the range of religious communities in American history who helped transform America to the better, often in opposition to more restrictive nativist, xenophobic things. And there were people from the fundamentalist world who often were part of the campaigns for social justice. And there were some who were part of the mainline groups who supported the most, the Henry Fords and the Charles Lindberghs and, those people, the rabid anti-Semites here who get like Henry Ford getting the highest award that Nazi Germany could give in 1938, just a year before World War II began. It was being part of the mainline groups, there was no panacea, no inoculation of vaccine against racism and sexism and xenophobia here. But in the main, here, in those two visions, we've always been in tension with each other. Sometimes that's been constructive tension, often as now with these Christian nationalists here, it is immensely damaging coalition impact of the use of religion. Here, they look at America and they see the rise of Black power in America and the Black Lives Matter movement in America, and they see that as what's profoundly wrong in America. And they look at waves of immigrants coming who have always enriched, in every generation, enriched our country and helped build our country. And they say, that's what's profoundly wrong about America. And they look at the LGBTQI community standing up for their rights here, demanding that they should not be discriminated against in any area of American life. And they say, that's what's profoundly wrong in America. And they look at Jews and they say, that's the cause of all these things that are wrong in America. Here, their conspiracies, their control of everything here is what's wrong with America. So this manifestation today of religion in public life from the far right undercuts everything that we have fought for in the coalitions of decency in America, that with all the distance we have to go and challenges we face, has made America a profoundly more just, fair, and equitable society. And I say that recognizing the racism, structural racism that still permeates us, structural sexism here at a time of a rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. I recognize all of that, but there are probably 250 million Americans, every woman in this country, every person of color in this country, every religious minority in this country, who today has rights and opportunities that their great-grandparents could only have dreamed of in their most vivid imagination about it. That's the paradox of America. Here, it's a paradox of religion's impact on America as well.
Reverend Howard, I don't even want to ask a question. I just want to hear what you have to say.
My heart hurts for the deep pain that people in the name of Christianity, in the name of the church, have recently caused, particularly our Jewish sisters and brothers. And we can explain it away, but it's scary. My neighbor down the street has two twin girls, and he talked about having these hard conversations with them about whether they should wear their Star of David crosses out in public anymore. I have students who won't wear kippah on their head anymore. And I think, moment to moment, I think they might feel safe on campus, but they don't know what it's like to go into Hillel. Will someone do something crazy because they believe one of these disgusting conspiracy theories? And I'm so sad about that. And I'm sorry, for the things broadcast on the side of buildings and stadiums, for sheets that have been hung over highways in California. Like, it's really a hard time to be Jewish in this country right now. It's terrible.
I think I'd say it's without taking anything away from all of that truth, it's also just a hard time to live with courage in this country right now. There is a lot of violence. The violence against Black people in this country is up like 202%. Even up higher than all the aforementioned groups. And yet we almost take it for granted because it's such just a recurring theme.
It always has been, Ben. Jews are the most targeted religious group, twice that of Muslims, and together we make up almost all of the hate on religion, but not alone. How many churches have been attacked here, and shootings have happened here? But we must never forget the African-American community remains far and away the target of the most significant number of hate crimes in America. And we're not just talking about the violent ones that make the headlines. Think of all the microaggressions that people of color have to live with, that the LGBTQ community has to live with day in and day out as well. It is a dangerous time in America for the reasons that Reverend Howard was saying. I'm sorry, Ben, I interrupted.
No, it's fine. And by the way, it's like a race that nobody wants to win. You know what I'm saying? but also, and this is, the beauty, I guess, of my discipline being an organizer and not being a clergyman, is that I can cuss more often, and I won't on this Zoom. But you can imagine, like, when I really had to dig into the Great Replacement theory, like what my response was. This idea that Black people have babies because Jews want us to, that people of color come to America because Jews want us to, like respectfully, Rabbi Saperstein, I don't need you in my bedroom to have a baby. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just insane. And I feel like sometimes, and this is the legacy of Harlem in my vocabulary, that the only logical response is to cuss. Like, what are they talking about? And there needs to be that, like, we can't just have a polite, educated, erudite response to something as fundamentally outrageous as the Great Replacement theory. At some point, you just got to call a spade and step to them and say, like, WTF drug are you on that you can even focus on that for 30 seconds?
One of my colleagues, I sort of stopped by her office to check in, and she's a Jewish administrator here. And I was like, how are you holding up with everything going on? And she's like, I'm okay. It feels like all this kind of contemporary anti-Jewish hate, she used the phrase, is a canary in the coal mine. And that it's signaling, as you said, something worse, something that it's just a hard time to be human, and that we are just an angrier world, a more fearful world that is just more hateful. And to kind of bring it full circle, I think that's exactly why we need to have conversations like this, not only to sort of name the demons and sort of call out what is ugly, but because it's our faith traditions that also present the response to hate. One of the great posters at a lot of the protests the last couple of years said something to the effect of, like, resisting pharaohs for 5,000 years, something like really, really cool thing, because it's religious traditions that know how to push back on bigots, that know how to push back on systemic hate, that know how to respond with love that changes laws and changes lives. And you're absolutely right. I think there is like, what's going on here? What's wrong with y'all? This is not okay. And to push back and fight with the love that our traditions show us how to employ, because we need it now.
Three brief comments to that. The first is, I'm sorry, I just thought of something. Forgive me. Here, the first that I would point out to us is that Jews are a paradoxical community. We're, on one level, we're white, overwhelmingly so, and with growing numbers of Jews of color, now about somewhere between 10 and 15%, the Jewish community are Jews of color. We have challenges in our own community. We have to recognize our own racism. We have to recognize, that hospitality. And I'm so glad that you, as a non-Jew in that Jewish camp, I'd like to think in general that has been the experience. But every one of my Jews of color friends can tell me of times that they were made to feel as an outsider, even in our own community, even by people who are not blatantly racist the way we think of right-wing racists today, but just again in the little micro things here that so often plague us. Here, secondly, we're talking about different groups. We're all in this together. We are all in this together. None of us are going to win this fight for the kind of America in which justice and peace and equality are a reality for every person here unless we do it together. None of us will be able to protect ourselves, our houses of worship, unless we protect all houses of worship, our communities unless we protect all communities, our children unless we protect all children. We are in this together. And too often, a lot of what happens is efforts to drive wedges between us in one way or another. And just finally, to observe how enormous the challenge is, just a single line. Kanye West has 30 million Twitter followers. Who in our community has anything in the communities representing the values we're talking about right now, has that kind of following? Here, there are some celebrities, sports stars who really do the right thing and are good here. But when someone spreads messages of division and hate and harm and has that kind of following, it is a real challenge here. You have to respond. You want to respond in a way, and you and I have talked about this with Minister Farrakhan's situation, Ben, but there's also reality that after a while, some people come to the defense of somebody, not because of that message, but because it's a woman being attacked over and over again, because it's a Black man being attacked by whites over and over again, because here it's a LGBTQ person who's being attacked over and over again, even though that has nothing to do with why they're being attacked, but yet that is also a reality in America, how easy it is to marginalize and isolate and really harm those who come from vulnerable communities. What a paradoxical set of challenges this is that we face in finding the right way to hold the coalition of decency together and not allow ourselves to be divided, and yet to be respectful of the needs that each of our constituent parts have.
We are, first of all, in closing, I want to thank both of you for your ministries, for your courage, for your friendship. And Reverend Howard, I look forward to getting to know you better in the chat here. We figured out that our family's both connected to the same little Black Episcopalian congregation in Baltimore, a small but mighty congregation of St. James. We are a paradoxical nation. I want to share a quick story to show that. Years ago, I ran into a white woman, 50 years my senior, who family used to own my family in Virginia. And we figured that out. And Skip Gates would later do our DNA and confirm that we were indeed both descendants of Thomas Jefferson's grandma and both descendants of the patriarch of the Bland family in Virginia, and very relatively closely related at that. And after Hurricane Katrina, she called me and she said, "Ben, we got this family in the lower 9th Ward, and one boy's in an iron lung, and the other one probably should be. Rare lung disease. The parents had a home-based business. It was an offset printing business. The floodwaters destroyed everything. The family's been evacuated to Baton Rouge. The boys are in the hallway of a nursing home, and there's mold running through the nursing home because the winds and the rain up in Baton Rouge, they weren't like the floodwaters in New Orleans, but they did a lot of damage. And if we can't get those boys out of there in a week, they will probably die. And I need a philanthropist, somebody who will just write a check to get them an air ambulance to Sacramento because this group's doing this and this group's doing that, and the Jewish Federation's doing this, and da 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 da. And there is a house there that they can have, and we can just get the family there. So I called the comedian Dave Chappelle, and he wrote a check for $30,000 for the air ambulance, have the boys sent from the lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans. Dave and I are on the phone a week or two later. He's my godfather's son. We're family. And FedEx has arrived at both our doors. He's in Ohio, mine at the time in San Francisco, at the same time, give or take. We open up this note of thanks from the family that we helped evacuate from the lower Ninth Ward via Baton Rouge to Sacramento. And we pulled the photo out, and it's a white family. And Dave says, Ben, did you know they were white? I said, Dave, she said lower Ninth Ward. I said, are there whites in the lower Ninth Ward? It's like the Harlem of New Orleans. He's like, God bless you and thank you. The Cohen family. He said, Ben, did you know they were Jewish? I said, Dave, I didn't think they were white. Why would I think they were Jewish? He says, well, Ben, you like to tell stories. Please don't tell this story for a while. And I said, okay. I said, why is that? He said, well, you know, he said, I've been practicing alms people from Katrina because my imam urged me to, and I have no idea how to explain it at the mosque this week. And I said, Dave, if they ask you at the mosque, and I've told the story at mosques, Dave, if they ask you at the mosque, you tell them this. This is exactly how America should work. Why should it be strange for the slave holding side of the family to call the old slave held side of the family to get alms from a Black Muslim to get some white Jews out of the lower Ninth Ward? But yet only in America could all of that happen. You know, that's what's beautiful about our country, about the, you know, perplexing nature of all of our people, David, and of our nation, and the great possibility when we just stop and respond to each other based on our basic needs. And what I would offer, and what brings us back to SP2, is that we are in a country that feels like it's about to be on fire. Like its people are tearing the country apart. Conspiracy theories are rampant. Hate is rampant. Anti-Semitism is rampant. Islamophobia is rampant. Racism is rampant. And you wonder what is going on. Ask yourself what's happening with poverty. Ask yourselves what's happening with poverty. Ultimately, it's the courage to end poverty, the commitment to end poverty that gives us our best hope to pull a nation divided together. Whites are downwardly mobile. They have been so for decades. White men in particular. White men in particular, their life expectancy is actually shrinking for the first time. That has a lot to do with all of this hate in this country. And it drives a line back to the worst parts of American history, the worst parts of European history as well. And so with that, it's my honor to bring on one of the great leaders of SP2, a great anti-poverty institution, the one that trained my grandma to help fight the war on poverty back in the day and empower her to train her mentee, would go on to be a US Senator, Barbara Mikulski. Dr. Jerry Bourgeois, will you please come on to help close us out?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ben, Chaz, and Howard for this incredibly informative discussion today. As SP2's Associate Dean for Inclusion, I want to emphasize that conversations like this one are vital to our school's mission. This is a prime example of the kind of necessary dialogue we want to continue to encourage in our community, and to also share that as a school, SP2 remains steadfast in its commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, intersectionality, inclusion, diversity, and social justice within our 5-degree programs and throughout our interaction with colleagues, students, alumni, and external partners. I invite you to learn more about the work that we're doing at SP2 by visiting our inclusion page, and the link for that is on our website. And I also want to thank everyone who joined with us today, and to encourage you to stay tuned to dates for our events in the spring of 2023. And we are also looking forward to the publication of Ben's new book, Never Forget Our People, We're Always Free, A Parable of American Healing, that will be available January 10th, right, Ben?
Yes, January 10th, you can buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or any independent Black bookstore. Uncle Bobby's in Philly, please pick it up. Please pick it up. Please.
Awesome. And I also want to put out a shameless plug for a course that SP2 is going to be offering in the spring. It's titled Spirituality and Social Work Practice that I will be teaching on Wednesday evenings. That will be looking at some of these issues from a diverse perspective and looking at how spirituality, both from a religious and non-religious perspective, impacts our lives, and how we draw on these resources and essential elements to build strength and to have courage and faith to continue the work that we're doing. So with that, I wish all of you a good rest of the day and look forward to seeing you at future events at SP2. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.